Well, thank you all so much for having me. So I'm Haiwen, and today I'll be talking briefly about applications of Gen AI in dermatology. This is like a part one of a two-part talk that Dr. Wong Wilson will follow up with specific recommendations about how you would want to incorporate generative AI in your dermatology clinics. But today I'm just mostly talking about one, what exactly is Gen AI? What are all these terms that we keep saying, this alphabet soup of terms? Two, how is this technology being implemented specifically in dermatology practices? And then three, a specific deep dive into AI scribes. And so, no disclosures. So we've heard a lot about Gen AI in recent years and a lot about these new terms and brand names. And I just wanted to throw this up there. These are just a list of companies in the industry that have been going on. And this is from June 2023. And there's a lot of people working in this space, from life sciences to admin to clinician facing. And I'm sure by now there are so many more, and just shows how much is rapidly expanding in this space. And so specifically in dermatology, we conducted a study last year that really explored dermatologists' usage of LLMs in their clinical practice. And we surveyed a total of 134 dermatologists from a wide range of career stages, found that about 65% use it in their daily practice. Over 50% use it daily or weekly. Majority felt that it was pretty accurate, which meant like there were some mistakes, but they could still use it very reasonably. And almost 90% felt that they would really likely use it in their future clinical practice. And so with all this excitement that we've heard all day, what exactly is AI? What are these terms that we keep using? And this is just like a brief overview, right? And so AI is this big umbrella. Within it, machine learning and natural language processing are sort of two parallel processes. And within that, deep learning, so DL, is a subtype of machine learning that focuses on neural nets, which is a type of architecture that is developed. And then finally, within it all is Gen AI, which is sort of this newest advancement that's been happening in the AI world. And so what is that? What does that mean? And so there are three main steps that are went through to create these usable generative AI models. And so it's pre-training, fine-tuning, and prompting. And so what pre-training is you take this large data set from the internet and you run these, what we call self-supervised learning. And so this is just where the computer takes information and learns patterns from this data set without humans having to be involved and tell them what's correct or what's incorrect. And this requires really large data sets to do so. After that, you need some fine tuning. And so this involves humans. And this is where you put narrow data sets that have, like, for instance, chest x-rays or biopsy-proven diagnoses, just information with answers that you put in to make this model the fine-tuned model. And finally, you go through some prompting. And so this is essentially where users can interact with the model itself, like when you type in prompts into ChatGPT and ask the questions that you're trying to ask. And ultimately, you create this augmented model that is now being used in a lot of sort of Gen AI terms. And so then it's like, what are LLMs, VLMs, MMs? What are all these things? So large language models are essentially just text only. And so the main difference between large language models, visual language models, and multimodal is the type of information that's being trained on and the type of information that you can input and output. And so large language models is text only, vision language models is image and text. And I'm glossing over the details of how image gets represented in these models themselves. They get sort of switched into numbers that are like essentially text, but I'm glossing over some of the details. And then finally, multimodal models are everything else. So audio, video, genetics, anything that you can think about. So now we have a better sense of what it is. So how is it being used in dermatology specifically? And so there are a couple main boxes. We talked a lot about administration, such as scheduling, prior auth, billing, a lot of communication with patient messages, inbox management, documentation with after visit summaries, this clinical decision-making bucket that we talked a lot about with differential diagnoses. And then finally, we talked a bit about education with patient handouts, research, et cetera. And so I wanted to pick 3 examples within this Gen AI use and give some specific examples. And so MedPalm comes out of Google, and this is a specific example within the bucket of clinical decision support. And so what they did was they studied inputting both photos and text data with patient history into this large model, multimodal model, and was really looking into how accurate a computer model would be able to identify these lesions. And so I just wanted to put this here because there's a lot of discussion about like clinical AI and clinical decision making and replacing dermatologists, et cetera. But I think this is just one small bucket in all the sort of uses of AI in dermatology. And I really just want to focus on some of the other 5 buckets as well. And so this is a study that explored AI use in communication, specifically in response to patient messages. And so this is out of Stanford. That's a 5-week QI study of 160 or so clinicians that are really looking to evaluate large language models to draft patient responses. And so they found that about 20% of these clinicians utilize this AI consistently. And while they didn't notice a change in the amount of time that it actually took to read the messages, write them, and respond, what they did find was there was a statistical significant reduction in this work exhaustion score and a decrease in EHR burden, which they evaluated using like a 4-item clinician task load score. And then I want to talk a little bit about in dermatology specifically, and this is more in terms of after visit summaries. And so this is a single institutional study that generated after visit summaries of 53 patients. And on a 5-point Likert scale, they found that about 96% of patients really would recommend the after visit summaries to others. They had a mean of 4.91 in terms of satisfaction and 4.89 in terms of how easy it was to understand from a scale of 1 to 5. It is important to note, though, about 20% of these did require editing by clinicians due to inaccurate information. I think we'll discuss more on that in the second part of the talk. But this really leads me to discuss sort of other avenues of documentation, specifically AI scribe use. And there's a lot of discussion recently around AI scribe use and how it helps with documentation, reducing documentation time, improving provider relationships. But again, like what exactly are these? How do they work? Why are we using them if we don't really know how they work? And so patient-provider conversation has this audio sort of capturing whether it's phone, computer, iPad, et cetera. And this is often fed into the speech-to-text model that is then converted to text. And then this text is now put into this black box AI model, which you guys now know is how we came from there, right? And then from there, this model outputs a medical note. And from there, the provider often needs to read through it and sort of manually check and update it according to how they prefer. And then sometimes, depending on the HIPAA compliance and sort of what settings you have with your model, you're able to sort of feedback loop and learn from what your initially and what your preferences are. And then finally, you just go through sort of downstream workflows and downstream tasks. And so looking a little bit into how AI scribe use has affected dermatology specifically, there's a pilot study that explored 12 providers using AI scribe services for a period of 2 years. And they really found that there was a decrease in amount of time per note per day and per appointment that was dropped off before and after AI use in sort of high adopters and low adopters of this technology. And then more importantly, they found out that patients really liked it. They found that patients felt that providers spent less time on their computers and they felt more personable and conversational. And so what should you do and what should you consider if you are thinking about using AI scribe in your clinical practice? And what are the pros and cons and what are the sort of things that you should evaluate? And so we talked a lot about it being time saving and sort of reducing the burden of documentation, but that sort of comes at a need for editing. And so a lot of folks sort of balance the time that it takes to write the note versus the time it takes to read the note and edit and sort of re-look at how things go. We talked a lot about efficiency and how it streamlines workflow and incorporating it into the EHRs directly. But then there's this sort of concern for quality and accuracy. And there are studies that show that AI scribes really have difficulty with 3 main components. One is very hyper-specific checklists. So if your clinic has, for example, like a transplant workup list that is very specific, AI models often aren't able to capture that. 2, there are specific style of notes that a provider likes. If you like bulleting points, certain HPIs, or certain underlying aspects of other things, the AI model often is unable to pick up on that. And then finally, I think it's, and more importantly, it's difficulty in managing diverse accents and speech and also noisy environments. And so these are just some things to consider when using your AI scribe in your clinical practice. We talked a lot about improving patient interaction where they can sort of communicate with patients instead of staring at their computer or looking at their notes. But then there's this concern about data privacy, and Dr. Wong-Fugelson will talk more about this in her talk about recommendations on how to use. All this above, all the pros lead to sort of reducing physician burnout, but then there's this sort of regulatory compliance concerns, right? What are the medical legal questions and who's accountable if the note says something wrong? How does billing work in this situation? And so again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the recommendations. So I think we've talked a lot about the technical details behind what generative AI is and studies looking into its effects and current uses, but what about using it in the real world? And what are your considerations into using it in your clinical practice? So there's a sort of translational pathway with incorporating any technology into clinical practice. And one, we need to accept the technology. Two, there are enough resources to push out. And then we need to be able to integrate it. And finally, governance and regulation. Maybe not in that specific order, and all sort of should happen at the same time, but these are sort of pathways that need to occur. And so then, as a part of the AED Augmented Intelligence Standards Working Group, we were working on creating a consensus statement on best practices of using Gen AI in your clinics that we'll be touching more on in the next talk. But essentially, we just conducted a brief lit review on current guidelines on Gen AI, and we went through a sort of 2-round virtual consensus process of 8 members of this working group with a variety of training backgrounds and from a variety of perspectives. And with this lit review, we were mainly looking at specific guidelines and recommendations for AI use. And so 53 manuscripts met requirements, but the majority of them were not healthcare related. And then only about 45% of them were like real world implementations. Among that 45%, only 6 were healthcare related and none were dermatology related. And so there's this gap in this space for practicing dermatologists using Gen AI in your clinical practices. And so this sort of leads us directly into the second talk that Dr. Wong Wilson will chat more about with specific recommendations that we came up with. But thank you all so much.
Thank you.